Welcome to RaWMachines, a journey into some of the world's most remarkable craft processes. In the previous episode, we followed the flax plant from sowing to harvest in the fields of the Hunsrück region. In this episode, the journey continues in the village of Dickenscheid. Here, individual flax threads are spun, warped, and mounted onto the loom in a strogo-ordered technical sequence, laying the groundwork for the entire process of hand-woven linen. Let's begin. In Dickenscheid, in the Hunsrück region, where many traditional tools and handcraft techniques have been preserved, the sequence of labor enters a new phase. The work no longer centers on processing flax stalks in the fields, but shifts into the village's winter workspaces. It is here that hand-woven linen production begins, with the preparation of the warp threads, a foundational operation that determines the fabric's structure, stability, and long-term durability. The direct material for the loom is linen yarn, produced during the winter months through hand spinning on a wheel. Once the yarn has reached the required uniformity and tensile strength, it is wound onto large wooden bobbins, each holding up to approximately 2,000 meters of thread. These bobbins are then mounted onto a creel and secured with steel pins, allowing the yarn to be drawn off continuously and evenly during warping. The number of bobbins in use depends on the intended warp density of the fabric. For standard linen cloth, at least 20 bobbins must run in parallel to form a stable warp system that meets the technical requirements of the loom.
Das ist arg fein, das da. Wer hat das eigentlich gesponnen? Die Schwiegermutter. Ah? Schön. Egal ist das gesponnen auch.
Und meine Mutter hat auch noch gesponnen, ja. Das ist 30 Jahre alt ungefähr.
Warte, ich sehe noch an. Lass halt fest so. So.
To begin the warping process, known locally as Zealand, the weaver uses a warping board, or sherbret. From each bobbin, individual flax threads are guided separately through designated guide holes on the board, establishing a strictly parallel order and preventing tangling throughout the operation.
So, hier auf der Seite. Gut.
Once all threads have been correctly threaded, their ends are gathered, securely knotted, and attached to a rotating wooden warping wheel, known in German as the Scherkrone. Set upright and free to turn, this wheel allows the weaver to define the warp length precisely and prepare the yarn system for the subsequent stages. One of the most critical steps in the warping process is the formation of the warp cross. Using the thumb and forefinger, the weaver divides the entire set of threads into two equal groups and places them alternately over wooden pegs in a fixed sequence. The warp cross plays a decisive role in preserving the order of each individual thread when the warp is transferred onto the loom. It ensures precise control during weaving, enabling a plain weave structure in which the threads are alternately raised and lowered, interlacing according to the fundamental over-under sequence. As the warping wheel begins to turn, the fully threaded flax yarns are wound gradually from top to bottom in a clockwise direction. The length of the warp is determined by the number of rotations of the wooden frame, with each full turn corresponding to the circumference of the warping wheel, approximately 3.35 meters. At the end of the run, the threads are guided around a turning peg to reverse direction. The weaver then rotates the wheel counterclockwise, leading the yarn system back upward. One complete cycle, one descent and one return, forms a single warp bout of 40 parallel threads, all cut to exactly the same length.
Weiter. Weiter. Weiter.
The weaver repeats the warping sequence until the required number of warp threads for the intended cloth is reached, to prevent successive layers from overlapping and altering the effective length. Each new warp bout is wound slightly higher or lower than the previous one in an alternating order. Throughout the rotation, the weaver continuously monitors and adjusts the yarn tension to ensure an even distribution across the entire warp system. At the same time, the warp cross at the upper end is held and controlled by hand, preserving thread order as the wheel turns. Each completed bout is marked with chalk, allowing precise tracking of the number of runs and overall progress. If a thread breaks, the process must stop immediately. The broken end is rejoined using a specialized weaver's knot, secure enough to hold, yet fine enough not to interfere with subsequent operations.
Weiß ich. Okay, bisschen festhalten.
Once the warping process is complete, the weaver verifies the total number of warp bouts. In this case, 36 bouts have been wound, corresponding to 1,240 warp threads, exactly the quantity required for the intended linen cloth.
Gib mir mal das Holz da.
Only after this count is confirmed are the yarns cut and securely tied off. A cord is then threaded through the crossing points of the warp cross, preserving the separation between the upper and lower thread groups even after the entire warp is removed from the warping device.
So, da kommen wir daher an der Eck da. Und dann mal hoch.
Maintaining the warp cross is essential, as it ensures that the order of every individual warp thread is retained during subsequent stages, particularly when the warp is transferred onto the loom.
So, jetzt ist das da. So. So, die 14.
To release the warp while it remains under tension, the weaver removes the upper crossbar of the warping wheel. Only once this bar is detached can the full warp bundle be safely lifted off, without disturbing or entangling the thread order.
No, stramm kann. Strammer, Halle. Festhalle, nur festhalle. Klappt ja, lieber fest. So, jetzt der Rest noch.
After being removed from the warping wheel, the entire warp, measuring more than 10 meters in length, is braided into a large plait, known as the ket. This braiding preserves the thread order, prevents tangling, and reduces the effective length of the warp to roughly 1/3, facilitating transport, storage, and preparation for mounting on the loom. The warping equipment is then dismantled and neatly stowed away. Any remaining yarn is rewound onto bobbins, ready for weaving or for subsequent warping operations. Once the yarn preparation stages are complete, work begins on setting up the loom. The loom is typically erected inside the living quarters or in a small workshop room known as the Baselkammer. Assembling the loom marks the beginning of the hand-woven linen process carried out to meet the everyday domestic needs of the household.
So, gut. Sagen wir das Querholz. Mal sehen, wie es reinkommt. So kommt es rein.
The assembly of the loom begins with the base frame, known as the Zalich, the structural element that carries the entire load of the weaving apparatus. This foundational stage is carried out by Wilhelm, Mosel, and Otto Klose, craftsmen with decades of practical experience in rural linen weaving. The lower frame components are joined using traditional mortise and tenon construction, entirely without metal fasteners. Each wooden element is positioned with care and driven tightly into place. The stability of the loom depends not on force or auxiliary materials, but on the precision of the joinery and the skill of the maker.
So, kommt der nächste.
Once the base frame has been aligned and stabilized, the vertical posts are erected in sequence. The corner posts are connected at the top by a load-bearing crossbeam, while the rear posts follow the same structural principle. Together, posts and beams form a balanced, rigid framework, providing the foundation for installing the loom's moving components in the subsequent stages.
So, gut. Nächste. Bisschen anziehen oben. Schlafen der andere Seite.
The wooden beams of the loom still bear visible traces of earlier mortises and additional wooden pegs, evidence of repeated repairs, replacements, and adjustments over many years of use. These marks testify to the continuity and adaptability of the hand loom as a working tool.
So,
A key component installed at this stage is the cloth beam, also known as the Warenbaum or Tuckbaum. Its function is to wind the woven fabric and maintain consistent tension throughout the weaving process. Installing the cloth beam requires experience and precision, as all wooden elements must fit together exactly. Even a slight misalignment can distort the warp threads during weaving.
So.
gut.
For professional weavers, the loom is typically left assembled year-round and firmly anchored to the floor or ceiling beams. This anchoring reduces vibration during heavy beating of the weft, ensuring structural stability and consistent fabric quality throughout the weaving process.
So. So.
The loom is a full-frame loom known as a Volwebstuhl, a type common to the Eifel and Hunsrück regions. Once assembly is complete, the protruding wooden pegs are driven flush, finishing the structure and ensuring safe operation.
Så, spikkedrikt. Eins rein.
The loom is then moved into its fixed position within the weaving room, with a finished technical size of 1.92 meters in length, 1.39 meters in width, and 1.89 meters in height. It allows the production of cloth up to 1.10 meters wide, well suited to domestic linen weaving. In the next stage, the weaver installs the principal load-bearing components of the loom, including the breast beam and the front crossbeam. These elements form the structural basis for mounting the moving mechanisms and for preparing the loom for the subsequent stages of weaving.
Querholz.
Once the main structure of the loom has been secured, the weaver installs the two treadles, connected to the frame by iron linkage bars. These treadles allow alternating control of the two sheds, producing the rhythmic lifting and lowering of the warp threads during weaving. Next, the warp beam is set in place. This heavy rotating component is cut with longitudinal grooves to receive the warp end holding rod. The beam is connected to a wooden ratchet mechanism, enabling the warp to be released incrementally and ensuring consistent tension throughout the weaving process. At the front of the loom, the cloth beam is operated by a hand wheel in combination with an iron gear and locking pawl. A retaining catch prevents free rotation and can be released by a pull cord, allowing the weaver to advance the cloth beam without leaving the seated position. During installation, small wooden pegs are shaped and driven by hand to secure the retaining bars to the warp beam. Though modest in size, these elements are crucial to the stability, precision, and safe operation of the loom's entire transmission system.
So, weiter. Also noch ein bisschen weiter vor. Gut. Einen Moment. So.
Once the drive system is complete, the loom is fitted with the components that directly generate the weaving motion. First comes the beater, web-laid, the oscillating element that drives the weft firmly against the fabric fell. Suspended flexibly within the frame and guided by leather straps, the beater delivers an even, controlled, striking motion. Mounted within the beater is the reed, RaWMachines, which presses the weft into the newly formed row of cloth. Traditionally, reeds were made from bundled reeds or cane. From the 19th century onward, metal reeds became increasingly common due to their greater durability and precision. Next, the heddle assembly, shear, consisting of 2 shafts, is installed. Each shaft carries metal heddle eyes, through which the warp threads are drawn, and is directly connected to the treadles. This assembly is the most wear-prone part of the loom, as it is subjected to constant friction and movement, and therefore requires frequent repair or replacement. Once the 2 shafts are linked to the treadles, the loom functions as a complete system, ready for the subsequent stages of warp preparation and threading. Under the guidance of Wilhelm Mosel and Otto Klose, the preparation of the warp begins. A wooden rod is inserted through the end of the warp bundle to secure the entire set of threads, marking the start of the hooking, tensioning, and finishing operations, steps that are decisive for the quality of the finished linen cloth.
So, mache ich die Knote fester. Da ziehen wir die Gänge auseinander. Da. So, die Gänge auseinanderziehen.
The warp is not handled as a single mass, but is divided into separate bands, known as gänge, each consisting of 40 threads. These bands are separated and gently spread out, while the order established during the earlier warping stage must be carefully preserved.
Dann jetzt die 2 noch, ein bisschen näher, dann geht's weiter.
At the front of the loom, a woman continuously adjusts the alignment and tension of each band, ensuring that the threads run parallel and do not overlap. At the rear, the men secure the wooden holding rod to the warp beam, creating a firm anchor point for the entire warp system and preparing it for winding onto the beam in the next stage.
So. Jetzt passen wir auf.
Das ging immer noch.
To distribute the warp evenly across the width of the loom, a wooden spacing reed is set into its working position. The warp bands are then inserted one by one into the gaps between the reed teeth, strictly following the order established during the earlier warping stage.
Da kann deze da hier richtig einlegen.
So ist richtig, ja?
Nein.
Wo ist denn der?
So, die nächste.
Das
Zieh
ist
noch mal
der.
das 6 Stück.
Unterirdisch. Wie stimmt's mal?
So, ja.
Das ist nicht der Abgang.
Der nicht, der nicht so. So.
Der hat noch zum Dämmler, ne?
The primary technical requirement is the absolute avoidance of cross threads. Even a single misplaced yarn can cause faults in the subsequent weaving process. Once the final band has been correctly positioned, the locking bar and wooden pegs are fitted to secure the reed, stabilizing the order of the entire warp system.
So, da kommen wir raus. So, der Stock jetzt.
Also irgendwie noch das.
So.
Schlecht geschmiert.
Winding the warp onto the beam is one of the most physically demanding stages in loom preparation. 2 assistants turn the beam using levers inserted through the wooden shaft. Each rotation is slow and deliberate, requiring considerable force to maintain even tension.
Jetzt macht euch das.
Gut.
At the front of the loom, Wilhelm Mosel monitors the path of the warp bands, keeping the threads straight and in proper order as the beam turns. At the same time, a woman guides and arranges the yarns by hand, ensuring that tension is distributed evenly across the full width of the warp throughout the winding process.
Hals weiter.
As the final length of warp is nearly taken up, a rope is threaded through the last loop to draw in the remaining yarn. Finally, the warp ends are securely tied to the breast beam, fixing the entire warp system in place and completing the beaming process.
Doch, geht. So, der nächste bitte.
So, also, wir zwei haben es auch geschafft. Wir gehen.
So, alle Wiedersehen. An der Jahrestag tue ich auch was wünschen.
Da sind wir mal gespannt.
Before the warp is mounted onto the loom, it already contains a crossing point formed during the earlier warping process. To preserve this order, the weaver inserts 2 lease rods through the warp cross, one after the other.
So, festhalten.
The first rod holds one half of the warp threads. The second secures the remaining half, following the alternating sequence of 2 threads over and 2 threads under. Once both rods are in place, the order of the entire warp is locked, ready for the subsequent stages of drawing in and tying on.
Gut. So, jetzt gibt's mal Cherry.
At this stage, the beater and the heddle frames are installed on the loom. The remaining warp from the previous weaving, known as the trumpf, lies at the front of the loom and is attached to the breast beam. It is deliberately retained to serve as the tying on point for the new warp.
So, da hängen wir zurück, greifen wir da oben. Und dann zurück.
The heddle frames are mounted one by one and secured with cord loops. The entire beater heddle assembly is then pushed forward to create working space. Below, the wooden rod carrying the old warp is set into the groove of the breast beam and fixed with pegs, stabilizing the warp system for the subsequent tying and threading operations.
So, da hol die Wasser war. Guck's mal, beim Blei steht. Ich lade ihn mal ab. Ja. So, dann. So, jetzt nochmal hochheben. Oh! Oh!
The loom is carefully inspected and adjusted to ensure that it stands plumb and square. If the frame or the floor is out of alignment, warp tension will become uneven and the woven cloth may twist. Once the loom has been properly set, the horizontal wooden bars are suspended from the heddle frames, preparing them for connection to the treadle system in the next stage.
So, jetzt mache ich den Strick ab.
Before tying on begins, the remaining warp from the previous weaving is trimmed to remove shortened or frayed sections, creating clean, even thread ends. The 1040 warp threads are then divided into bands of 40 and rearranged in preparation for the tying process.
So, jetzt wäre das fertig. Müssen wir hier drehen. Gut so. So, jetzt kommst du hier.
Jetzt probieren wir noch an dem anderen, ob das auch so lang geht.
Next, the loops of the new warp are cut open. Auto close releases additional length from the warp beam to provide sufficient working allowance. The warp is then laid in correct order on the lease rods. Both edges are measured for alignment and trimmed to equal length.
70 graden drehen. Mit drehen ziehen.
Ganz so viel.
So.
Vielleicht messen wir von der. Ja, halt extra. Hier ist so lang.
So, ist gut. Gehen wir auf die andere Seite an der Gartenbahn und drehen wir ein bisschen zurück.
Once the thread order has been securely held by the lease rods, the retaining cord at the warp cross is removed, allowing the threads to move freely during tying. Finally, the warp beam is braked to prevent rotation, completing the preparation stage and readying the loom for the tying on process.
Sitzbank. So.
Once all preparatory steps are complete, the tying on of the warp begins. Each old warp thread is joined directly to a new one, strictly following the order previously secured. In this process, two parallel threads are treated as a pair, known as kameraden, while each individual thread is referred to as a kamerad.
Der war zurückgelagert in einem Plastiksack.
Skal vi så? Ja, hier ist noch ein Kamerad. Da moet het dan komen, dat we die richtige lagen krijgen.
Each joint must be tied with a knot that is extremely small, yet strong, durable enough to withstand weaving tension, but fine enough to pass smoothly through the heddle eyes without catching. For this reason, linen yarn intended for weaving must be highly uniform and stable, ensuring that both the tying process and all subsequent operations proceed without interruption.
So, einen Moment. Jetzt wechseln wir. Diesen Zwanger da. Jawohl. Einen Moment, oder? Mal gerade ausschneiden.
The tying on process demands intense concentration and places considerable physical strain on the weaver. Prolonged stooping quickly tires the eyes and strains the back. To improve precision when twisting and knotting the yarn, the fingers are often lightly greased, allowing the threads to grip without fraying.
So, die nächste zwei, oder? So, weiter der nächste. So, gib mir noch den Faden daher. Ist das der Kamerad dazu? Ja. So, gib mir den Faden noch. So, reichen wir den nächsten Faden, oder?
Environmental conditions within the weaving room also have a direct impact on the quality of the work. Cold temperatures numb the hands and slow movement, while excessive heat alters the yarn's moisture content, making it prone to distortion and uneven tension. During tying, when the yarn on a bobbin runs low, additional bobbins are suspended behind the loom to ensure a continuous supply and prevent interruptions in the process.
So, oder die zwei Fäden, die knoten wir an der eine da an, dass der Salven steiger wird.
Ja, das war schon mehrmals gemacht.
Stramm halten, die Spule. So, ich tue noch die Schere.
Ja. Deckel aufmachen.
After the tying on is complete, the entire warp is brought to a stable working tension by linking the breast beam to the cloth beam, creating even tension across the loom. The work then proceeds to drawing the knots through the heddles. Beforehand, the warp ends are smoothed with a horsehair comb to reduce friction. The weaver then lifts each heddle frame in turn, guiding the knots carefully through the heddle eyes. This stage requires great caution, as even a slightly oversized knot or an imprecise movement can break a thread or damage a heddle eye, interrupting the subsequent stages of weaving.
Die Teile aussauen dran, oder?
Ja, ja. Wie noch Arbeit.
Gibt's noch die Knöpfe?
So.
Så, der er spejskiver. Hier er der spejskiver.
Ja, jetzt muss das weggehen.
Gut.
Ganz so lang.
Wat eruit? Hoog hier.
Schief.
Hoog en dief, hoog en dief.
Once the knots have been drawn through the heddles, the heddle assembly is returned to its central position in preparation for the next step. The reed is temporarily removed from the beater to provide sufficient clearance for pulling the knots through, and is then reinstalled in its proper position.
Ist drin. Wat een
Wilhelm Mosel then steps inside the loom to connect the treadles to the heddle frames, completing the control system. If a thread breaks during this process, the weaver uses a passierhaken to draw the yarn back through the heddle eye and the reed before retying it, ensuring that both thread order and warp tension remain uninterrupted.
Zo, daar. Vaart hem reinvuren. Goed.
After the warp has been drawn through the heddles and the reed, preparation begins for sizing the yarn to protect it during weaving. In the kitchen, a woman cooks the sizing paste, a solution that strengthens the yarn, smooths its surface, and reduces the risk of breakage under friction. The sizing is typically made from dark rye flour. The flour is first mixed with cold water, then hot water is added gradually, and the mixture is stirred continuously to produce a smooth, lump-free paste. This treatment is applied to linen and cotton yarns, while wool yarn requires no sizing.
Og der kommer han med stikkefest.
Ja.
So, dann bringe ich noch mal die Spielchen und die Schläfe.
Gut.
Ja, da können wir gleich anfangen nachher.
Ja, dann webt man schön nachher.
Ich denke, das klappt.
After all warp threads have been tied on and drawn through the heddles and the reed, the warp is given a final tension adjustment.
So, fertig.
Additional lease rods are inserted to keep the threads flat and stable, allowing the weaver to survey the full width of the warp and detect any irregularities at an early stage.
Da setzt sich mal drauf.
Before sizing is applied, the loom is test run. The weaver alternates the treadles to check the opening of the shed. One half of the warp must rise evenly, while the other lowers, creating a clean and clearly defined opening. Any unevenness or obstruction requires immediate correction.
So, jetzt schieb over. En hoch. Noch zurück. Noch zurück, noch ein bisschen. Gut. Jetzt zurück.
Once the loom runs smoothly, the sizing paste is brushed onto the warp. Applied in thin, even layers along the direction of the threads, the sizing is not intended to stiffen the yarn, but to form a light coating that smooths, strengthens, and reduces fuzz, thereby minimizing the risk of breakage during weaving. Excess sizing would cause the threads to stick together and prevent the shed from opening cleanly. After sizing, the warp is left undisturbed until completely dry. Only when the threads are dry, stable, and sufficiently strong is the loom truly ready for linen weaving.
So, oder? Geschlicht hätten wir.
Ja.
Jetzt kann das trocknen.
Ja, maar goed, dat is ook nog.
So.
At this point, the entire process of loom preparation is complete, clearing the way for the weaving itself to begin. Before weaving can begin, hand-woven linen production in Dickenshide passes through a rigorous sequence of preparations, in which every technical operation determines both the stability of the loom and the quality of the finished cloth. This process reflects the essence of traditional weaving, knowledge passed down through generations, collective coordination, and skilled control of material through manual expertise. The loom is not merely a tool of production, but the center of a technical and cultural system, where these quiet preparations are ultimately transformed into durable linen cloth. Thank you for following the story to the end. If you'd like to continue exploring the final stages of handwoven linen production, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you won't miss the next episode. RaWMachines. See you in the next video.